A federal appeals court says Arizona's method of teaching English language learners is okay, but that doesn't sit well with everyone.
The whole idea, and it's stated in the law, was that it's expected that these kids would learn English after a year, but it hasn't turned out that way.
Teaching English has changed in the 2 decades since the Flores case was filed.
In the actual test, there's a reading and a writing component and an oral component as well.
Teaching English as a second language and keeping students caught up in other subjects. This is Arizona Week. Hello and welcome to Arizona Week. I'm Christopher Conover in for Lorraine Rivera. This week, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals turned away the latest appeal in the Flores case. The suit filed more than 2 decades ago centers on how English is taught to students in the Nogales School District who don't speak English. We begin our exploration of the topic with Tim Hogan, the attorney representing the plaintiffs. Tim, this case has been in the courts for over 2 decades. To begin with, can you explain what happened this week with the case before we get into the history and what it all means going forwards?
Sure. This week on Monday, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit affirmed an order that Judge Rayner Collins issued in this case over a year ago, after a 3-week trial in which we had challenged the 4-hour model of daily English language development for English language learners on the grounds that it denied English language learners access to the academic curriculum and unnecessarily segregated them. The Court of Appeals affirmed that order and dismissed the case.
Let's back up a little bit for viewers who may not remember how this all began more than 2 decades ago. What was the basis of the original case? And some people would say, how did a speedy justice system get here 2 decades later?
Well, the case was originally filed in 1992 on the theory that under the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, which is a federal law that requires states to take appropriate action to remove language barriers so that students can equally participate in the instructional programs at public schools. We filed a lawsuit claiming that the state of Arizona was not taking appropriate action because it was inadequately funding English language learner programs. So that was 1992. There was a trial in 1999. That was part of the delay, obviously. And then the district court judge at that time, Judge Marquez, ruled in our favor in 2000 and ruled that the state was not adequately funding English language learner programs, which resulted in crowded classrooms, not enough materials, not enough trained teachers, a whole long list of deficiencies in the English language learner programs. Then we spent a long period of time trying to get the legislature to respond to that judgment. And so funding was increased to some extent in 2001, and then cost studies were ordered, but the legislature disregarded those. We sought contempt against the state and the legislature. They intervened in the case. The case ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
And now here we are. Things have changed, I would assume, since the case was originally filed, just because we've had changes in leadership. Things like No Child Left Behind were passed federally, which I know worked into some of the decisions as this moved along. Are things better than they were, or just new faces, new names?
Well, they're better and they're worse. So it's never that simple. Certainly No Child Left Behind focused a spotlight on English language learners and other vulnerable student populations. Up until that time, we weren't really tracking English language learners. We weren't measuring the success of language acquisition programs. We weren't measuring the progress the academic progress of English language learners. And so they were just virtually being ignored as part of the education system. And so those things have all improved over that period of time to where a lot of time and attention is spent on examining the progress of English language learners and the efficacy of the language acquisition programs. On the other hand, the state legislature in 2006 enacted a very draconian language acquisition program, which requires English language learners to sit through 4 hours of English language development every single school day, and without any real showing that spending that much time on English language development every day is any better than any other program. But that program's been in effect now since 2006. It was implemented in 2008. And obviously, if kids are spending 4 hours in English every day, where the state prohibits the teaching of other academic content standards, they're not getting the same academic content that other students are.
And that was part of the contention on this appeal, that it almost creates a separate class, not a school class, but class of people within a school if you have these kids 4 hours a day sequestered from the rest of their classmates.
Well, there's two problems here. First of all, English language learners come to school generally behind academically as it is. And if you're going to spend 4 hours every day the theory was that if you spent 4 hours every day, the kids would learn English quickly, exit the program, and then participate equally. But the evidence in this case showed that kids were still staying in the English language program for 3 to 4 years in both the Tucson Unified School District and the Nogales Unified School District. So it wasn't improving the exit rates of these kids. The whole idea, and it's stated in the law, was that it's expected that these kids would learn English after a year, but it hasn't turned out that way. And so they're in these programs for 3 to 4 years and getting further and further behind academically. And the law requires that the students be segregated. So you have English language learners in schools that are large enough actually being confined to the same classroom. And of course, at lower elementary school grades, that means they're basically going to be segregated all day.
As you mentioned, things have changed. This has been up to the Supreme Court. This has been back down and now working forwards. Is there one more appeal left in this, or is this case officially settled in the legal world now?
Well, this case is not quite finished because we have the opportunity to file a petition for rehearing with the Ninth Circuit, which we plan to do. And those are infrequently granted, and we can't count on that. So if the court doesn't entertain our petition for rehearing, then this case would be closed.
This case was originally filed, as we mentioned, out of the Nogales School District. All the kids who were named have moved on. Do we know what happened to all of them, or some of them?
Well, you'd think that would be the case, but it's not quite accurate. Miriam Flores, the named plaintiff, who's the class representative here for the class of parents and students in Nogales, still has at least one child in the Nogales public schools.
So obviously still ongoing in her world. And what about the kids? Ms. Flores' child who this was filed on behalf of, she has to be old enough now with the number of years she's probably, if she went to college, she's probably out. Do we know what happened to her?
Yeah, I believe she actually got her college degree and is working in the Phoenix area now.
Is this something that can be fixed with dollars by the legislature, in your opinion, or do we have to really rethink the system as a whole?
Well, I mean, dollars, let me back up to, I mentioned cost studies, about how cost studies had been done here. We're funding ELL students an extra $380 or something like that in Arizona. All of the cost studies that were done under the auspices of the legislature showed that it costs at least $1,200 per student to adequately support English language learner programs. So yes, dollars matter and dollars could help. However, on top of that is there needs to be some recognition about an evaluation of programs that actually work. There's been none of that in connection with this 4-hour model. We had various other models in place prior to this 4-hour model, but nobody has ever studied what works best here. So it would be kind of silly to just put dollars into the program without knowing what really works here. And it's kind of extraordinary that after all these years, we don't have reliable data to tell us what works. So that's a big piece that's missing here.
All right, well, thanks for sitting down with us and talking about this case that has been going on for more than 2 decades.
You're very welcome.
The Tucson Unified School District is the second largest district in the state. We sat down with Mark Alvarez, the head of the district's language acquisition program, to talk about how the district handles non-English speakers. Let's begin by setting the table, if you will. TUSD is the second largest school district in the state. How many kids in the last school year were in the English language learner program?
Well, right now, identified ELLs, we have nearly 5,000 students that are identified under ELL. That means they've identified, they haven't passed a proficiency test, and gets them identified for placement in the ELL program. But we also have reclass kids that have passed a proficiency test after a couple of years in the program that still need a lot of the support. So when we look at English language learners, we not only see how many ELLs we're serving in the ELD program, but we also see how many kids that are still learning and adapting, putting the English language to use, are we serving throughout the district. And when we look at that, we're looking anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 kids.
How do you go about identifying the kids, and how do you figure out when it's time for them to get out of the program?
Well, identification comes, when they register. There's a home language survey that asks 3 questions, and basically what is the language they first spoke at home, what is the main language at home, and if they answer anything other than English to one of those questions, they are immediately identified for assessment. Some kids might pass the test. They call them IFEPs. There's so many monikers, IFEPs, that they're initially fluent in English. But many do not, especially at the kinder level. Many kinders do not pass that test because it basically is a basic skills test. And then if they do not pass it, they're then identified to be placed in an ELD classroom.
So a child is identified, put into the English language program. How do you know when it's time to get them out?
Well, they have a series of tests. We have a fall test, and we also have a test in the spring. And depending on how well they do on that, we call it reclassification. They have to pass 3 subtests in the actual test. There's a reading and a writing component and an oral component as well that they have to be proficient in to have overall total proficiency. And then they move what we call into a reclass identification.
What's the average amount of time the kids are spending in these classes before they're moved out into the rest of the school or out of the program?
Yeah, right now in our district, they're spending anywhere from 2.8 to 3 years in the program, and then reclassifying into what we would call a mainstream, which is now my mainstream class that they're not just focusing on ELL instruction development of the language, but just which we would call a regular mainstream class. So it's about 2.7 to 3 years.
Before we began this interview, we were talking, you said there are some changes coming in the coming school year, which you're very excited about, coming down from the Department of Education, State Department of Education, on how you work with these kids. What are the new changes?
Yeah, one of the things we're very, very excited about is something of when we got this mandate from the district a few years ago of how we were going to instruct the ELLs in response to many things that were going on at that time, they looked at it basically in silos. So things were taught, an hour this, an hour that, an hour this, an hour that. Now, what the new things that are coming along from ADE, which we're really excited about, is the fact that now they're looking, depending on the proficiency level of the ELL student, we're looking at now doing what's natural for teachers and saying, well, let's do 120 minutes of vocabulary integrated with reading, 120 minutes of grammar, with writing. So things that make more sense when we teach, because we never teach in silos. Teachers are integrationists by heart. So that new refinement is allowing us to look and say, let's do 120 minutes of things put together, 120 minutes of subjects put together, instead of saying an hour of a sole subject by itself, an hour of a sole subject by itself. Now, in the secondary level, it's very exciting because depending, again, on the proficiency level of the child, there may be a chance that we can, instead of the 4 hours of ELD instruction, we might be able to minimize an hour, even 2, which gives that student more access to different curriculum in the high school, different periods, different electives, and something we were always looking for our kids, to give them meaningful access just like any other student to electives and fine arts and things of that nature. So we're very excited about those changes.
I was going to ask about that, especially at the older levels. The mandate is 4 hours of English language instruction. How do we keep these kids moving forward from your experience so that they graduate on time or very close to on time potentially?
Yeah, well, that's very important with the training that we've done with our district, and I think we, in answering what we did with the ADE mandate years ago, we were very proactive in training all our teachers and making sure they had the SIOP strategies, acquisition theory of learning a language. So it's very important that we continue to do that and monitor that in the secondary to make sure that those classes are true ELD classes and that the instruction is modified and accommodated to our students to put them on track to graduate.
As we wrap this up, we have about a minute left. I'm sure things have changed, even in the last few years, and coming up things have changed. Has it been a radical change over time, the way the instruction is taken care of?
I think there's been more of a focus. There's a silver lining in a lot of things. At the time when we were asked that you have to teach this, and that, and we agreed with the focus on our ELLs. The part where we differed in was the fact of separating the kids to do this. But the silver lining has been that we have focused more on our ELLs, English language learners, and there's been more of an intent, more of a targeted instruction towards our English language learners by teachers. And at the same time, we could target our professional development and training of our teachers to be able to teach our kids best practices.
All right, well, thanks so much for sitting down with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
To help us understand how teachers learn to teach English, we turn to Mary Carol Combs from the University of Arizona's College of Education. We've spent some time on the show talking about the Flores case and looking at this from the district level. Let's look at this from a little different level. You teach the teachers who have to teach the kids. How do you go about teaching future teachers to teach English to non-English speakers?
Well, there are really 2 ways that we do it. There are 2 approaches. One is to help teachers understand that they have to incorporate different kinds of methodologies. And the other way is how they have to modulate the actual delivery of their instruction. And by that I mean they have to slow down their speech, simplify their instruction to a certain degree, increase things like wait time, use a lot of repetition, and also paraphrasing. They have to learn how to connect what they're teaching to what they taught the day before, the week before. They have to preview what they're doing tomorrow or next week. But in terms of actually adjusting the way that they teach, that also means becoming quite creative about what they do and how they do it. So for example, instead of teaching social studies out of a book, for example, they might, if they're teaching, you know, that in Western society we measure time from left to right, from early to most recent. And instead of doing that, you know, concept out of a book, they model it by actually lining the kids up in a line to represent a timeline, so that the child on the left represents the earliest event and the child on the right, so that you actually have a physical manifestation of a kind of theoretical way that we measure time. Same thing with math. If you're teaching negative numbers, for example, you can actually line the kids up, or you can use a string so that the middle of the string is 0, and kids to the left, or to my left of the string, to my right of the string, are negative and positive numbers. So that, you know, your teachers are sort of forced to become very creative in the way that they introduce particular subjects, just to make it more understandable. So teachers also do a lot of modeling.
When it comes to teaching English language in Arizona schools, there are certain rules, and we were talking a little bit about it before the interview, that there can't be a lot of content within that teaching. It's just learning English. Is that my understanding correct?
That's correct, and that is actually one of the dilemmas that we have in colleges of education in our state. So that, for example, in the course that I teach, it's a course called Sheltered English Content Instruction. That is actually an actual methodology that's based on theories of second language acquisition, designed for teachers who may not necessarily know the language that the child speaks. But it is a way for teachers to learn how to teach content to children with whom they don't necessarily share a language. And that incorporates all of the approaches that I explained before. Unfortunately, in the state of Arizona, there's a rigid policy that basically segregates children for 4 hours a day. Now, that has been modified somewhat at the secondary level. But essentially, the curriculum in these 4-hour blocks is grammar instruction, the structure of English, vocabulary development, and reading instruction. Not to say that those things on a limited basis are unuseful. It's just that while the children are learning these things for 4 hours a day, they don't get content like social studies, science, even language arts. And it's not just that teachers are precluded from delivering this. It's that when, let's say, a child is in the 4-hour block for a year and is not reclassified as a fluent English speaker, the child then goes into another year of 4 hours a day of grammar, vocabulary development. So what I'm saying is that when the child is eventually reclassified, he or she is very behind in content instruction, and it's difficult to catch up. And the State Department of Education has actually presented in PowerPoints and conferences that it organizes around the state that teachers are not allowed to present content. In fact, there's a kind of well-known PowerPoint that's up on the website, and one of the slides is very clear. It says ELD is not math, not social studies, not science, and not optional. And so the idea behind the policy is that children are not ready to learn content until they acquire English. And there's a certain logic to that. It just happens not to be true. Kids can acquire content while they are acquiring English. It's just that teachers have to be trained. They don't come to this methodology overnight. They have to be introduced to it. They have to practice it. And the research is very clear that by teaching only grammar and vocabulary, children do not acquire English as well as they do through content subjects.
Well, Well, thanks for coming in and sitting down with us and explaining some of the methodology of teaching teachers to teach English.
Thank you.
And now for the buzz with my colleague, Zach Ziegler. Zach, thanks for sitting down with us. This was the week that we got unemployment numbers for Arizona. There was some drama, but let's start with the numbers. What are the numbers?
Well, the numbers on the surface are looking good. The unemployment rate is under 6%. That's the first time since 2008, and that was as we were going on the upward trend from the Great Recession. That number's looking pretty solid, but job growth has still been a little slow. Private sector only added about 1,700 jobs in this report, which is about on par with what we've seen lately. The big thing, though, was layoffs as the heat comes. The summertime means a drop in employment in areas where you get tourism, and it also means a large drop in the government sector as teachers and other school employees come off the payrolls.
We began the week with some drama, if you will, in advance of the numbers. Aruna Murthy, the economist who has always done the briefings on these numbers, was fired at the beginning of the week, and there was some drama around all of that.
Yeah, that she had been doing these reports since 2009 and had really been in charge of them for the most part, really delivered some very thoughtful analysis, had always said, yes, it's great that the unemployment is dropping, but the thing to watch is the number of jobs that are added. There's some speculation from some that might be something behind it, that she was delivering so-so news as opposed to these lovely, 0.2 of a percentage point drops that we've seen in the last few months in the unemployment rate. There's some thought about that. It is hard to tell with this report because this report always looks like this. The ones in May and June, you always see these massive drops because, well, who wants to go on vacation somewhere that's 110 and also losing all of those teachers? So we'll see if that changes as we get past the summer months, and if the message changes is maybe they get a new economist into Aruna's spot.
I know there were accusations of the governor had a hand in this. Aruna not giving out good news that he wanted to hear. The governor's office did deny all of that. Zach, thanks for that update. And that's our show for this week. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for tuning in.